The prior point you mentioned is something that we talk about a lot, so much so that actually my partner and I are writing a book on it, specifically about a book on like helping people navigate dynamic change. And that exact conundrum of like when is the right time to do some of these things, I think is one of the areas where we encounter conversations where we find ourselves wishing, oh, I really wish we'd had this conversation a year ago. When you were 50, this would have been like really, really easy and really cheap. And we could have explained to you why it's going to get so much worse when you're 150 people versus 50. Or before you take and hire people in 7 time zones, it would be really good to solve this particular infrastructure problem.
Welcome to Ansible Edge, the podcast highlighting visionary leaders driving small tech-focused businesses. We showcase agile innovators converting bold ideas into sustainable growth and operational excellence. Each episode offers actionable insights, inspiring stories, and practical guidance. Join us in exploring the future, learning from successes and challenges, and understanding technology's transformative potential with empathy and curiosity. Welcome to today's episode. We're honored to have Noah Landow, CEO of Macktez, as our guest. Noah leads Macktez, a managed service provider based in New York City, which has been serving clients for nearly 30 years. With a background in architecture, Noah brings a unique, multidisciplinary approach to IT services, helping organizations navigate dynamic change through long-term partnerships and innovative solutions. In this episode, Noah shares how Macktez supports clients, the importance of open knowledge sharing, and lessons from high-profile projects like New York's Little Island. We also dive into the evolving role of AI and automation in internal operations and client services, Noah's approach to evaluating new technology, and the critical importance of trust, security, and adaptability for the future of MSPs. Join us for an insightful conversation on technology, change management, and the future of IT services. All right. Welcome, Noah. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Where are you calling from?
New York City?
Excellent. And how's the weather there? I know some ice storms just rolled through Canada and in towards your area. Stormy there as well, or?
In a bizarre twist, it's incredibly balmy. It's like 68 degrees right now. I actually walked outside yesterday and was perplexed at how it had gone from 40 to 70 in the space of a day. So it's actually like spring weather right now. Very
That's awesome.
disorientating.
I'm
The
jealous.
opposite of you guys.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
before we started the recording, Noah and I were talking about how New York and Colorado have kind of flipped places because we got like rain and sleet last night into 40-degree weather today, and 70 degrees and balmy sounds nice.
Definitely.
We spend a little more time outside today if I can.
So I have been, obviously digging through your site, and I love the fact that you guys release so much information to, I mean, not just end users, but really anybody who just goes to your site. I mean, the latest one was obviously the iOS 18 and talking about how BYOD is significantly improved with that. But I just love how you look at things through a lens of user education, and it's not even just your customers that you want to educate, it's anybody who comes to your site, which is fantastic.
I think kudos to that goes to Jeremy, who's our director of client services, and Sarah, our client services coordinator. I think one of the through lines for us, we've been around for a long time, we're coming up on 30 years. And I think one of the through lines for our organization has always been about not kind of holding things back and sort of like feeling like you need to protect things, but recognizing that the sort of generosity of just being open to conversations and opening to kind of like topics and sharing and answering questions sort of like kind of helps you long term. Most of our relationships are quite long term, and the people who stand to benefit most from some of these kind of posts and website informational things are maybe they turn into a client someday, but even if they don't, we kind of, I think, helping to translate some of these complicated, confusing topics into something kind of legible is obviously something our team really enjoys.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading something similar concept the other day about how as you're like, if you're publishing content and educational content, especially, your work is like 90% giving it away for free, and then you're charging for the 10% where your content or your services are most valuable. So diving in a bit more to Macktez and in your business, what types of clients do you focus on serving, and what types of relationships do you have with those clients?
That's a great question. We have a few different, one could argue I'm oversimplifying a bit, but we essentially have two different types of relationships. We have, and we have many client relationships which combine both of these. For many organizations, we function like an MSP, which I'm imagining for most of this audience is an acronym that they know, but managed service provider. Typically, it's like outsourced IT, outsourced technology, the help desk, the managed systems, backups, cybersecurity, all that kind of stuff. For many organizations, we serve as the MSP entirely, in other words, replacing what would be an in-house IT department. We also, for many organizations, do what's called co-managed, which is that we work side by side with often 5 to 10 or even 20 in-house staff who handle different aspects of technology. Sometimes we manage the fleet, or we manage the help desk, or we don't manage the help desk, but we do manage escalation. In both those cases, we're doing what is typically in the industry called sort of MSP or sort of managed service, and we are a managed service provider. The other thing we do is we do a bunch of kind of one-off projects. And the kind of projects we do could vary from something that's often called a lift and shift, which is a term for basically moving a bunch of equipment from a colo or an in-house rack to typically the cloud nowadays. It could go many places, but Azure or AWS. And also projects like physical office moves. We do have an in-house sort of low voltage team. My background is in architecture, so I kind of fell into this from that side. So it's not unusual for us to get involved in a project where there's 3 or 4 different kind of technology and low voltage and kinds of vendors, and a client or an owner's rep is looking for kind of a way to kind of translate, mediate, and kind of coordinate among all of them. And so part of our role sometimes is to come in and be like, that thing isn't big enough for that thing. Do you guys know that? That thing is going to be too hot in the middle of the summer. Has the engineer, do they know what you're planning to put in there? Is the piece of equipment spec for that? And so we do kind of like filling in the gaps. Again, an example of that was quite high profile was Little Island, which is a park which was built completely from scratch on the west side of Manhattan. And pylons floated down the river and kind of placed, and it's a gorgeous, kind of amazing park, multi levels, built completely offsite. But one of the core components was sort of not just where to put the technology infrastructure, but also how to understand the ramifications of being over water, since that obviously has significant implications for where. It's also some of the locations are effectively outdoors, meaning they were in a component or in a part of the facility that isn't air conditioned. So we, in that particular case, had to do a lot of work to understand what the thermal ranges, what the power of obligations and capabilities were. Big part of what our CTO did for that project was kind of work very closely with the MEP team on electricity and cooling to understand how to reconfigure a bunch of electrical stuff so that critical infrastructure that the fire department and other security components would rely on would have power provided by a set of backup battery components that were in a different part of the park. So there's quite a bit of like coordinating among people who all have lots of expertise, but don't know that they're supposed to be providing, that electricity is supposed to go there, not just there. So there's that element, and also understanding the wireless and cameras and access control and just the data layer of things like point of sale systems too.
That makes a lot of sense. And we were in New York about a year ago, and I wanted to go to Little Island, but we didn't make it. So I'm now even more excited to check it out the next time we're in the
Highly
area.
recommend it.
And it also, this explanation really brings a lot of things together, because when I was researching you prior to the call, you look like this Renaissance character with like architecture and technology and all these things. But the way you paint the picture there, I can really see the juncture that a lot of your projects are in, where it's technology, but it's in a specific physical space, and you're really dealing with a whole host of challenges that your architectural background would lend itself a lot of strengths.
And I appreciate that, but it's also the team as a whole. Our CTO, Riley, came to us with a mechanical engineering background, and he's been with us for 13 years, and he's sort of grown into sort of a pretty fantastic, very clever and very sophisticated CTO. But again, from this sort of other, not IT background. My business partner, Michael Horst, who's our COO, comes from a molecular biophysics background. So quite a few of the people in our team, even the person who is our director of client services, took a few years off to write a couple of novels and screenplays, and then kind of came back and rejoined. So a lot of our team, I think, has a really interesting mix of backgrounds and prior experiences that I think inform kind of a little more of I would hope, an interesting, but at a minimum, I think a little bit more of a broad view of like how to solve a problem, not just a boilerplate sort of classic way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like systems thinking, multidisciplinary approach. Probably better for relating to clients as well.
It is. Yeah, for many, many years, for probably our first 15 to 20 years, we described our clients as primarily creatives, because many of our clients were small architecture firms, design firms, creative companies, media, film. In the last 15 years, we've sort of stopped using that terminology because the technology needs that those organizations rely upon have shifted a little bit. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little more down the road, but the landscape now versus the landscape 10, 20 years ago in terms of what a smaller company can do on their own and what they need help for has changed profoundly. Examples of that are, 30 years ago, we would run a bunch of maintenance software on a bunch of computers to keep them running reliably. And nowadays, that's sort of like a silly idea. Nobody like runs maintenance on a computer anymore. That's just like a nonsensical thing. Similarly, it's often cheaper to just buy a new computer now than it would be to like fix a set of components in it. And that, of course, is very different from, we were spending $10,000 a machine when we first started for these, tripped out machines that are capable of desktop publishing. That, of course, extends also to cloud services, hosting, and email. And a lot of these things are essentially all kind of defined as SaaS services where you can show up with a credit card and a modicum of technical savvy and kind of navigate an experience that gets you a functional solution. So it's been exciting for us because it means that the kind of problems we're dealing with are more complicated, more interesting, weirder, and quirkier. And a lot of what we're being brought in to work on and a lot of what we're focusing on is not the same thing over and over again. It's this sort of diverse, evolving set of challenges of like, this is a challenge because this company hasn't changed this component in 10 years, which opens up a new set of pickles of how do you take this 10-year-old thing and actually get from there to here. The pre-existing manufacturer solutions don't work at that scale. Something else has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Worked for a newspaper publisher here in Denver, a weekly publisher, and was trying to help them switch to a new press software for like laying out the newspaper, and they were going to have to do it for their entire company because they actually had weekly newspapers in 10 different cities, and it was a really complicated project that I was trying to run on my own, and like it just ended up being something that I presented to the CEO, and I think the price tag was a little too high for him at the time, but I still have friends who work there, and they ended up having to bite the bullet and pay for like an outside technology firm to come in and help them with it. And I think that it ended up costing them more money than it would have if we had done it when I wanted to, which is just to say like, the costs of doing something, the cost of not doing something are sometimes really hard to sell and differentiate to stakeholders. And I feel like that's something that you're probably fairly good at, just given the type of projects that you discuss and the clients that you work with. But it sounds like you have a lot of balls in the air, which, I think that segues into the kind of our main topic of discussion, which is like automation. And where do you think that automation has made the biggest difference for you? And like, where do you think you're still hitting friction?
That is a great question. Before I answer the automation, the prior point you mentioned is something that we talk about a lot, so much so that actually my partner and I are writing a book on it, specifically about a book on like helping people navigate dynamic change. And that exact conundrum of like, when is the right time to do some of these things, I think is one of the areas where we encounter conversations where we find ourselves wishing, oh, I really wish we'd had this conversation a year ago. When you were 50, this would have been like really, really easy and really cheap. And we could have explained to you why it's going to get so much worse when you're 150 people versus 50. Or before you take and hire people in 7 time zones, it would be really good to solve this particular infrastructure problem so that you're not spending $100,000 on basically like coordinating with people 24 hours a day to make this change. So we actually just finished a project with a company I won't name that, at 50, it would have been a small project, but they're doing it at close to 500 people in, 7 or 8 different time zones. And it's been like a $250,000 project that is just inordinately more complicated because of the fact that, they waited to basically fix this problem about 2 more years past where we all wanted them to. But anyway, to answer the question that you asked secondarily, I think AI is super interesting and a little scary and a little unnerving and a little bit disorientating, in part because the term AI is used to refer to such a enormous range of things. I often, when I'm talking about AI, kind of in my mind, so translate that as machine learning or statistical machine learning. But it's also worth note that sort of generative AI and analytic AI are two kind of conceptually extremely different things. They both have kind of melded together in the kind of hype cloud of media in front of us. But when we talk about things like doctors' offices or medicine kind of using AI to analyze images. That's, of course, analytic AI. And when we talk about somebody like typing into ChatGPT and getting an answer back, that's generative AI. And there's obviously overlaps and components there. The areas that I think are frankly most exciting are more the analytic side. I think a lot of the things that are extremely interesting and already functional, that already like achieving like real payouts, are tools like systems that can be good about reviewing a bunch of tickets in two different ticketing systems and kind of finding a way to sort of connect those two, things that would be inordinately laborious and frankly error prone for a human being to do or to try to do in any sort of like straightforward, old fashioned sort of like, tag based sort of like manually scripted automation. But to do it with these sort of like AI assisted tools, there's some very interesting stuff coming that I think could have profound implication. I think also has Microsoft talked about this quite a bit a couple of months ago, but this interesting element of like agentic, the idea of like how much of our experience of AI will be essentially through our traditional interfaces and how much of it will be abstracted. I actually did a senior thesis in architecture on my thesis was before kind of wireless headphones and stuff, was this idea of this like crazy little wired device that would like sit over your ear and then like connect to a device in your pocket. And the idea was it was like you would walk down the street and use like voice recognition to like query this thing. Now, of course, it's sort of a unremarkable banal, but in 1995, that at the time was kind of exciting. And I think one of the kind of core components of that vision was this idea that you're kind of having conversations with a system, kind of like having a structured command sequence. You're not saying, please look up the address for this address and then give me directions. You say, hey, how do I get to Frank's house? And I think that's been the promise of a lot of sort of voice sort of systems over the last 10 or 15 years. But I think we're right now in the last sort of frankly 2 to 3 months starting to see tools that are vastly more sophisticated at interpreting and producing kind of inputs and outputs that actually map into that. So I think it's very exciting to see how some of these more sophisticated systems will actually work. It's also kind of scary because it's very difficult, I think, to differentiate which of those things are going to be like, forces for cultural good and which of those things will be, disastrous. I think it's like who gets fired and what roles are replaced by what and how good are the systems that are being put in place and what does it mean to oversee them or manage them.
I totally get where you're coming from. And my day job, I do a lot of like automation development with tools like Zapier and Make and things like that, or AWS Lambdas. And I use ChatGPT as kind of a thought partner to help me work out the way that code and things should flow, or what the best way to like go about getting something is. Like my degree programs do have a certain amount of developed experience in them, but I'm not a developer. I know enough to be dangerous. I know enough to understand how code works and how it runs, but I don't know enough of the syntax or anything like that to actually like do something without diving in and like taking a development course. But GPT and other tools like it are very helpful because they do know the syntax, and I can be like, well, this is how I want it to go. And then like with this Zapier automation I've been developing, it uses Python code, and I'm like, nope, it's not quite right. I think it should be like this. And ChatGPT will spit something else out for me to test, which I really like because it's like a force multiplier for me as an individual who, like, rather than have to go get a developer to help me with something, I can just work together with ChatGPT for that.
I use Gemini as my default, but exactly the same situation. I had a very silly example recently where I hadn't done, it's probably been 5 or 10 years since I'd done a cascading style sheet HTML update on like my personal webpage on Landow.com. And it was like, oh, this is really old. I really need to update this. I should at least, fix A, B, and C components. And I started poking around and I was like, I'm really rusty. And I started sort of searching and I was like, is that still how that works? And I was like, let me just see if Gemini is effective for this. And there were a number of points where I was like, I'm trying to do this thing. I can describe to you in sort of semi-technical language what I want to do. Like, how do I do that in current cascading style sheets and HTML spec? And it was obviously a conversational exchange, but it was shockingly good. I would say 50% of the responses were like, oh, that's actually good. And the fact that I could respond being like, yeah, that's good, but I really want the text to be a little bigger, or I have a sort of a little bit of a design background. So one of my responses was, The type that we're using is fine. I'm using Garamond, but I'd really like a Garamond web font that has non-lining numerals, which is kind of an esoteric. Non-lining numerals are the numbers that drop and go up, so they're kind of like lowercase letters, as opposed to lining numerals, which are the ones that are all the same height. And I was like, I'd like something that's like this classic serif font, but I'd like something with a style. And it came back with like, here's 3 suggestions, 2 of which were terrible, and 1 of which was fantastic, which I'd never heard of. And I continued to have sort of a sort of back and forth where I was sort of blown away by, some of the suggestions were incredibly good. Some were just totally wrong, but some were incredibly good. And I was able to put together something, I think, in like 2 or 3 hours that I easily would have spent 3 or 4 times on that if I had just been like searching and querying, WC3 documentation. So exactly a similar kind of a bit of impressed at the collaborative quality of that. I think was a very interesting element.
Yeah, and one of the things I love in conversations like that with LLMs is you're conversing with an expert UX designer, and then you're also conversing with an expert web designer at the same time. And the chance of getting that in one person, like on call right when you want it, anytime, is just amazing. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. Like the range of, I heard one quote, I think it was the CEO of Anthropic the other day, was like, 1,000 geniuses in a data service or in a data center. That's what we all have getting access to. And what will this bring the world? And like you said earlier, Noah, it's like, it's hopeful and terrifying at the same time. Like how many people are going to lose jobs, but how many more jobs will be created? And like Josh was saying, each of us will all be amplified in countless ways.
Yeah, I think the kind of disconcerting piece of it is I found success through this experience, but 2 of the 3 options that were suggested by Gemini were atrociously bad, embarrassingly bad. Like if it had been a designer or a coder, I would have been like, this person is incompetent and fired them for it. But there's this sort of interesting element of trusting the AI, both as sort of, it's like impressed at how well it does, but also cutting it a lot of slack for like, it's not really a person. And I think that idea of like, how do you like manage? I in my brain, I try to think of AIs in this current moment in time, kind of like a very weird EA. It's like they're an executive assistant who is like highly skilled, but also like kind of a weirdo. It's sort of like you kind of have to trust but verify. You can't really trust that the thing you got back is what you think it is unless you've do the due diligence to like truly vouch for it. So in that sense, it's like managing an underling or an assistant or a contractor. I think what's very interesting is how radically that landscape keeps shifting, and it doesn't seem to shift in like a. It's not like they're all just getting better. They're getting better in weird ways, but they're also sometimes getting worse in weird ways. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be very peculiar about the next year is like trying to conceptualize this sort of ever shifting landscape of like, is it 10,000 experts or is it like 1,000 experts and 1,000 lunatics? Because sometimes it feels like you're not really quite sure whether the answer is from a crazy person or from a person who you like vetted and interviewed and hired. And then sometimes the next question answer you get back is like, what? Where did that come from? And again, if that was a staff person, I would be like worried about what was happening in their personal life. But that's obviously not something that happens here.
Absolutely. And the confidence around the wrong answers are still, it still sounds very high. Like, oh, I know the answer. Like you said earlier, here's 2 things that are absolutely wrong, but then here's a really great answer all at the same time. You pick what you think is going to work.
It's like, it's on you. You're the human being who's taking responsibility for this, which is an interesting and strange space, not really analogous to any prior kind of technology. It's also the rapidity of change right now, I think, is a big part of what I find a little emotionally unnerving about it. Is it's like the experience you have today, the experience I had 2 months ago, the experience we have 2 months from now, like those are quite different. We had a technology, we have a talk series in my office called Tata Tech, which is like every other month we have a person with a bunch of deep expertise in some area. We actually have a talk next week on albinism. The prior talk 2 months ago was on thermal energy storage for sort of like green, basically energy storage in industrial scale. But the December one was specifically on AI, and it was an interesting kind of opportunity to think like, what has changed since then? And in the last 3 months, a great deal has changed. A lot of things are quite different than they were even that recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like you are keeping an eye and keeping your finger on the pulse of like automation tools. Are you helping your clients and customers with automation and like implementations there? Or are you focused more on like Macktez and what you're doing there, or your personal, or all of the above?
That's a great question. I think we're getting questions from clients, but the bulk of our clients, I think, are not quite positioned to take advantage from a like MSP systems perspective. They might be taking it. I'm sure many are taking advantage of it sort of individually, but from a like automation system production scale, I think a lot of that is very exploratory. When we're talking to a CTO about how his 1,000-person organization is going to take advantage of AI, it's a very, very different conversation from talking to like a director of operations for a 30-person organization that's just like, oh, I'm experimenting with using it for writing HR reviews. Like those are very, very different. I think the areas that we're most effective and interested in is the sort of like deeper, sort of more embedded components. And those are extremely unstable. Those are sometimes like wildly different today than they were last week. Questions that comes up a lot when we start thinking about automation is sort of like, how do you maintain this automation and how reliable it is, and how do you oversee it, and how do you ensure that it continues to do the thing that you thought it was doing? For example, if you build an automation between two different cloud services, and you're like what degree of confidence do you have that the data is you verified it at the beginning, and then what's your process for verifying it continuously? That is more complicated by AI in some cases because of the uncertainty of like, it's more difficult in many of these scenarios to explain what actually happened now. So it's a different sort of undertaking to determine what the data flow and verification and output and like who's monitoring what. The areas that I think I'm selfishly, personally using it for most are obviously for personal explorations. I think as CEO, my biggest, most important role was to be kind of looking kind of 6 to 18 months out. And so a lot of what I'm focusing on right now is not tools that are effective now, but tools that have a trajectory that I think would have profound implications for us 6 months or 18 months from now. That's probably 50% of where my work is going. The other 50%, I think, is sort of exploratory curiosities. There's a number of AI adjacent tools. For example, we use an identity platform called JumpCloud, which is sort of IDP. Really, really great platform. We've used it a lot. We're very closely with JumpCloud. Our COO attends their like annual meetings. Like we work with them a lot because they're pretty fantastic. We have done a bunch of work in the last couple of months to like enhance and improve the automation so that we can take things like tickets and HR requests and move those all the way through a whole series of sometimes 20 to 40 steps to onboard and offboard people. So a big part of what our kind of technology services team is doing is looking and saying, how much of this process is definable? Can you capture this piece of information and use that to get all the way to here? And there's a lot of things that you can do now that we couldn't do a year ago. We actually had built a whole tool that I think was Python based that was essentially completely kind of homegrown, and then began to realize that each of these tool sets we were using have a more sophisticated version of that had kind of been released in the interim. And so now retooling that to see what you can take advantage of. It's like we're seeing a lot of clients that are extremely nervous about their revenue. And so there's an interesting element of like a lot of times we'd be looking for like new, interesting projects. And instead, trying to make sure we're looking at like how do we look for opportunities to reduce the cost, to simplify, to streamline, sort of the inverse of maybe what we would do at a more exciting kind of technology landscape time.
Absolutely. I totally get that. In my day job right now, we're working to consolidate duplicative SaaS, and like learning how to sell that to internal stakeholders is always really hard. But I was going to say, I know JumpCloud well. I'm JumpCloud certified for sysadmin positions. No, well, it's a lot. It's a big pie to kind of wrap yourself around and understand all their offerings, but it does a lot. And I do love all the new automation things that they've created for identity management, especially around their dynamic groups and how they're rolling it out for devices now. It's pretty fantastic.
I think we're in an exciting time. We have a client that has just finished, in the substantial completion sense, a migration from a legacy kind of hybrid on-prem AD solution to JumpCloud. And it's a particularly exciting transition because that offers a bunch of new things they can do. But it's also an interesting time, I think, because a lot of the device, iOS, of course, has some very interesting data segmentation functionality that is sort of on the cusp of arriving. And so there are a number of components in which things that wouldn't have been possible, or BYOD solutions that would have been uncomfortable in the past are kind of like suddenly like, oh, that's a real viable tool for a very disparate organization in a way that it would have been rejected earlier. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah. So Noah, you spoke a bit earlier about looking out ahead and vetting new tools. Can you describe your process for when you're assessing new tools? What's your vetting process on what might be appropriate for your clients or what you might want to use with your company going forward?
That's a great question. My answer is going to be something of a cop-out, which is that I think, looking at tools with an perhaps overly, but certainly optimistic eye. And so I'm trying to identify tools that are worth exploring further. And then when that exploration looks like it's actionable, or we've reached a point where it's like, hey, let's try to implement this, I'm typically handing those off to maybe our director of technology services or our director of client services, or one of the technicians in one of those departments. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that the landscape is changing fast enough that if I get a little too bogged down and sort of like really trying to like make some of these systems functional in the current state, it's easy to sort of lose the sight of the horizon. And a big part of what I'm trying to do right now is sort of like not get too distracted by the trees and kind of keep an eye on the forest.
Gotcha. So it sounds like your role then is more in discovery of like options and what might be possible. And then you're cataloging that, and then you bring in other team members to do more of the vetting and the evaluation.
Absolutely. Typically, I would grab a meeting with Tim, our director of technology services, and say, hey, how are we handling this particular goal? Right now, it looks like there are 3 tools that are recently out that seem like they would offer significant improvements. Can you share your thinking? And in many cases, he has already been thinking about either those or similar things. Kind of compare notes on that. And again, as a CEO, I feel like my job is generally to provide a set of goals and metrics more than it is to tell people how to get there. And so I'm often saying, hey, these systems, these tools imply that there's a path from here to here. I'd love for you to like investigate that and actually determine, like, is there really a path? Is that a viable thing for us? And then kind of come back in a month or a week or 6 months and have a conversation where he's like, these two just didn't really, they didn't work well enough, but this one was really interesting. It worked a little differently than we expected, but we're actually doing a test right now with this client to confirm that this thing works the way we think it does. And if it does, then we'll implement that in a broader sense.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So in terms of, looking ahead, and you said your role as the CEO, you're setting goals and objectives, and looking at the metrics for the organization. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you want, like some of the top things you'd want to change for Macktez and your clients going forward?
Great question. That's not really AI related, although I think AI stuff is part of that. We're relatively small. We're about 20 people. And we've sort of floated between 20 and 30 for, frankly, most of the last 20, 25 years. And I think one of the things we're seeing is an opportunity to have the existing team do better and more. So, our hope, our expectation is that we won't reduce size, but I'd like to be able to grow the number of clients we handle without having to add a lot more people. And obviously, there's automation tools that seem like they have the potential to fix that. Also, frankly, improvements in technology and some of these SaaS offerings make things possible. For example, we had a client where the only way that we were able to migrate a bunch of older legacy Windows machines from this sort of hybrid AD environment to JumpCloud was that they needed to basically, it's a long and complicated reason why, but basically for data loss reasons, they had to ship the machines to us. We would ship them a new one. They would like have the two side by side, migrate through some cloud service, and then ship us the old one back. And partway during that like 6-month implementation, JumpCloud and Microsoft changed a couple of kind of components that made it possible suddenly to actually do that migration live without data loss risk or without significant data loss risk. And we were able to retool that project to have it be completely remote. That made a huge difference because it obviously trimmed $50,000 or $100,000 worth of shipping and new machines and equipment. So those are areas where I think it's exciting to see the tools get better. So if I were going to wave my magic wand, it would be to continue some of those trajectories, some of the zero touch and remote device management, cloud-based management, some of the kind of tools that we're using. Use Ninja as one of our MDM tools in addition to JumpCloud. We use that for a lot of like auto repair, things that break. We use that to fix it before the end user finds out about it. So I'm excited to see our team continue to improve those. Obviously, those tools getting better and better makes the lift less intense for our team. It's great to have the tools work better. And of course, our team has to patch them all together to make sure they actually work well in the real world for real world clients. But as CEO, of course, my primary job is really growth. So when I think about what is it that I'm most excited about trying to achieve for the next year, 10 years ago, almost all of our clients were like 20 to 40 seat count. They were relatively small. And over the last 10 years, we've shifted to having 3, 4, 5, 6 clients that are much, much larger. Some ones as large as 1,000. bunch which are 500, a number that are a couple of hundred. And so I think one of our kind of initiatives, one of our goals for this year is to identify and work with in-house technology people like CTOs or VPs of engineering to sort of do a better and better job at the sort of like co-management component to take some of the like regulatory and compliance and security kind of responsibilities off their plate, let them focus on the mission and the vision of the organizations that they're there to take care of. The CTO is there to like achieve the goals of the organization, not to, hit a bunch of HR or finance tick marks on a compliance box and let us take care of that stuff. I think having those scales increase, the number of seat count, having the number of seats and the sort of count of like total machines under management, it's been a really exciting and explosive growth over the last few years, and exciting to see that number continue to grow kind of in that same trajectory. So my magic wand would probably be to have 2 or 3 more organizations at that scale. I think that would be a really exhilarating opportunity for us to kind of continue to iterate and have enough frequency of kind of recurrence of some of these things that we can get a chance to like really polish those the brass knobs so that they're super smooth.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it sounds like the long arc is internally you're focusing on empowering each of your employees to augment themselves more through better use of tools and better tools as well, as everything
Carefully, but
evolves
yes, yeah,
quickly over time. And then
exactly.
from the
With a discerning eye, let's say.
yeah, definitely, because you don't want to just add tools for the sake of adding
I don't
tools and then
I don't trust that Gemini is right without checking. It's like there's this element of like, yes, collaborate, but with a certain a modicum of suspicion.
yeah. But it's kind of that theme of, whether it's AI automation or just the general arc of software tools becoming better and more proficient.
Obviously intertwined.
Exactly. And it's like augmenting the power of each individual employee, and also teams to do more. And then it sounds like from a growth perspective, you're focusing on like larger seat companies, either new companies to work with or like maybe deepening the relationships with existing partners.
Yeah, I think the clients we have are our relationships are pretty wonderful. I wouldn't really look for to change anything. I think most of the clients we have are we're supporting them to the full extent that their resources and their kind of needs align. Our client services department, I think, is pretty great at sort of maximizing the relationship. So most of, I think, the area for growth for us isn't our existing clients. Frankly, I think quite a few of our clients will shrink in terms of their revenue because there will be pressures on them to reduce costs. And so part of what our job is to look for like, hey, what is the minimum essential management toolkit we can use? Like how cost can we make this kit so that this client has the budget to manage this growth spurt and doesn't run out of runway because they've burned too high at a per user cost.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So helping current clients manage costs when necessary, but then as a business growing with larger seed organizations and with new biz. That sounds good.
Absolutely. I mean, luckily, that's the area that I am theoretically focused most entirely on. So I get to get excited about that. It also means that I have reason to talk to all sorts of really interesting people. And as I mentioned in passing a little while ago, my business partner Michael and I have been working on a book for the last year, which is sort of talks a little bit about that. And I'm hopeful that we're in the third pass through that. I'm hopeful we'll be comfortable with that in the next month or two, and excited to sort of finally get that out to the world and frankly start having more conversations with people about messages in the book, just really about navigating dynamic growth for organizations.
Absolutely.
So rolling back just a little bit to talking about like Macktez and how you like your seat count, you like where you're sitting at with the number of employees, like it'll grow, it'll contract a little bit over time, obviously. But it sounds like you want more, you want to empower your employees to do more with the tools that they have, and hopefully that would make them more effective, more powerful as individuals. Are you in kind of that end, are you testing any agent-based tools, or are you seeing any like on the horizon that like really make you interested and excited?
It's a great question. All of my testing with agent-based tools has left me nervous, not excited. I've just seen there's a number of competitors in this space. Electric is one that kind of rolled out Electric AI, which rolled out as their kind of initial position was basically they've changed, but initially they were like basically join us in Slack, and then our AI agents will take care of all your support over Slack. And it was obviously for many organizations disastrous. Was risky 5 to 10 years ago, and even now it's still a little squirrely. I think we're not at a point where those tools are good enough to to be entrusted with that level of responsibility. I think we're probably somewhere between 6 and 18 months before any of these agentic kind of like functionality pieces begin to be trustable. I think that there's a lot more niches that are kind of prominent where they're kind of augmenting and assisting. I think one of the challenges is that the agentic components have to have an extremely high level of trust to be effective. It's like a self-driving car. Like if you don't trust the self-driving car to drive, then you're still sitting there not only in the car, but also you're theoretically supposed to grab it at any moment before it does something horrible and kill someone, which in some ways is sort of the worst possible combination of like, you're not off the hook, but you're also kind of lulled into complacency by the fact that like 99 hours out of the 100, there's nothing for you to do. So I think that's one of the great conundrums of a lot of these agentic components is like they have to be kind of amazingly good in order for us and people to trust them. I think there are use cases. There certainly will be examples of organizations, which are probably not us, where the standard of quality is low enough that that's acceptable. I think our standard of quality is extremely high. Like white glove is sort of our legacy. So we're not an organization that's going to want to risk, 1 out of 100 of these interactions being a disaster. But there are other organizations that do and will. And I think that, that's interesting. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that progresses and what the tolerance is for mistakes and errors. I think the agentic component is fascinating, but also the sort of black box quality of it, I think, is one of the more unnerving elements. And I think there's a bunch of interesting kind of theoretical work happening of like, how do you kind of like analyze a black box system and produce some sort of reporting or documentation or kind of like confidence in the decision trees that it's making. And I think we're at the very early stages of that kind of insight, the sort of the CAT scan of the agent. And I'm curious 6 months or so from now what that looks like. That might be much, much more confidence inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been playing around with GPT's deep research, and one of the things that I really like about it is that it does kind of display that stream of consciousness, analyzing of what it's doing, why it's doing that. And I think that you can even stop it like midstream and be like, no, you're going off on a tangent, like redirect this direction, which I think is really, really useful and really helpful. So, kind of talking about your role in the company and what you're doing, like what do you see as your biggest opportunities in the next 6 to 18 months?
Security. I think security is an area where 2 or 3 of our larger relationships, if not based on, certainly triggered by some large element of the work that we're doing, kind of owes its sort of instigating to either concerns about security or in some cases a security incident. And security is complicated. It's not like a button you press. It's a whole workflow. It's a whole set of user training. It's a combination of both systems and protocols and people and tools and technology. So there's sort of multi-layered kind of elements when we talk about security. It's often a sort of amorphous blob. So I think when we think about our opportunities, a lot of them are going to be organizations that kind of moved quickly and then looked around a little bit and were like, ooh, we haven't buttoned things up. Like we don't have multi-factor enforced everywhere, for obviously an example of low-hanging fruit. And so those are opportunities to say, do we have device trust? Do we have like what degree of access do we have for control to our dev clouds? Like what kind of logging do we have? How are we handling mobile devices and people on 6 different devices? Like how are we logging, tracking, and understanding that? So I think JumpCloud or AD or Intune or Ninja, these are all tools that help to kind of address components of those challenges. But we recently started talking a lot about cybersecurity insurance and cybersecurity kind of like evaluations. We've started doing a bunch of NIST, NIST-based sort of like evals of organizations to try to say, hey, here's a standard framework that is used to talk about this stuff. Like you don't have to answer yes to everything, but let's just make sure that we get through the list so that you're aware of the areas that you aren't doing something standard and you're aware of the areas that you are. And if you do want to make changes, let's talk about what those changes might look like and what tools would be involved and what the kind of workflow human experience implications would be. Just talking about last week and have been doing for the last year or so.
Yeah, the security landscape seems to be constantly evolving with the cat and mouse. And it's interesting to hear you describe it because it's like you're noting it's not just a button you push. There's systems and the technology and the hard part of it. hard side of it. And then there's the soft side with all the human elements as well. So, well, this has been a really fascinating, wide-ranging discussion. Honestly, exactly what I expected from, what I knew about you previously, Noah, and your really broad background. Just kind of wrapping things up, we like to ask, is there a book or podcast or person or some sort of media that has inspired you recently and really motivated you and kept you going?
That's a great question. I found myself ruminating a little bit about like movies or books that I've read recently. I have found during difficult times that I tend to mostly read easy fiction, a lot of science fiction. When I think back though on books and texts, I'm not much of a podcast person. I tend to listen to podcasts only when driving with my wife and not generally outside of that. But interestingly, when I think about books, a couple of books have come up a bunch of times in the last week, which are not terribly, maybe inspiring is the wrong word, but 3 books that we used to give as required reading when people first joined the company. One is David Allen's Getting Things Done, which I like to reframe not as a book that's about becoming more efficient, but a book that's about managing your anxiety and stress, which is sort of the lens through which I kind of find the book to be most effective. It's like, how do you clear your head? How do you get yourself to a point where you're not kind of distracted in the moment when you're supposed to be doing this thing by thinking about this thing that I forgot to write that down. What did I do about that? Did I remember that? So Getting Things Done as a tool set, even if only partially implemented, has some really great psychological sort of like self-aware components. Checklist Manifesto, which is a pretty great book by Atul Gawande, about the understanding the difference between like process documents and checklists, 2 very, very different things. But understanding like when you're doing something iteratively, not just improving the process, but improving the implementation of the known process that you all agreed you were going to do. Really intelligent, really great people often skip steps because they're like, I got it in my head. I know I don't need to check. And there's a sort of a modesty to recognizing that no matter how smart you are, you probably need a checklist if it's important. And the last one is Kaizen, which has come up a bunch of times, which is sort of like small steps. I love the idea of like frequent iteration, trying to make the modifications and improvements on something small enough so that the sort of risk of failure is incredibly small. Part of the reason why all these books I think are particularly interesting is that one of my other sort of side interests is that I am active for many years, for over 25 years, with a very esoteric Japanese martial art called Aikijujutsu. We're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary of the New York dojo in August, which is exciting. A bunch of people from Japan and maybe Finland and Australia and stuff will come for that big public demonstration at Mark Morris Dance Center. And part of what's interesting about this martial art, it's a kind of old-fashioned Japanese martial art called a koryu, or a Koryu. And a koryu is essentially pre-war, so it's sort of like samurai era, although the Western kind of exoticism paints that in a way that isn't quite the same in Japanese context. One of the other famous koryus is ikebana, the flower arrangement. So it's not always martial sort of style. Sometimes it's just like very traditional. But there's a huge component to it, which is just really about like emptying your head and being present in the moment, not anticipating, not obsessing. One of the pieces of advice I give to students a lot is after you've done a test or something, you always have some technique that didn't go right. And it's like a critical part of that experience is sort of being like in the moment and being like, that went wrong, it didn't work, clear your head, dump it and move on. And I just think that's something, particularly in difficult times, is like a very, very important kind of tool to practice over and over again, to just be here. You're here now. You're not there. You're not in the future. You're not in the past. You're actually right here. This is where life is. So have practiced familiarity with getting yourself here.
Yeah, that's awesome. The great list of books. I've read Kaizen. It's outstanding. I need to revisit it at some point. But in terms of being in the moment, as you were describing it, I was thinking the American version of this is like Ted Lasso. I don't know if you've seen that
Absolutely.
series. Be
Very
like a gold.
inspiring. Lovely. Exactly. There's a mind like water is the traditional Japanese thing, but goldfish is a fantastic metaphor as well. I love that. That's a lovely piece of fiction in part because it's so heartwarming. I think the sort of the naive sort of ingenuity and charmingness of success, despite not being an expert in the field, is a fascinating thing to use as a frame.
Absolutely. Well, Noah, thanks again for joining us. Again, fascinating conversation, wide ranging, and I'm looking forward to putting this together.
Awesome. Well, great to meet you both, and I look forward to talking. If I ever make it out to Colorado, I hope it's all right if I look you guys up. And obviously, if you make it to New York, please don't hesitate to drop us a line.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Noah.